Hi and welcome. This is Lockdown TV from UnHerd.com. Today, joining us all the way from Montreal is Gad Saad. So he is a professor of evolutionary psychology. He's a writer, he's a blogger, and he has built up quite a huge social media and YouTube following over the past few years as a truth teller. This is a free speech environment. We like to hear truth, and we don't worry about taboos or things that are awkward to say or hear. So at the moment, it seems like we've emerged out of this very strange COVID-19 period, or we are still emerging from it. And suddenly the culture wars are back in a big way. We have the Black Lives Matter movement in America that has then spawned kind of sympathetic movements all across the world. And at least in the UK, we now have the trans issue right back front and center since J.K. Rowling said something that was deemed to be cancelable. So let's start with the Black Lives Matter movement in America, in the United States. What is your view of that? What do you think is really happening there?
I mean, I think more importantly for me than to actually analyze the movement itself is the fact that the movement has become sacrosanct. You cannot be seen as criticizing the movement in the same way that when I grew up in the Middle East, there were things that you could not do. In some cases, you can't criticize the government. In other cases, you can't criticize a particular religion. In other cases, tied to that one, you can't criticize a prophet of a religion. And so what we're seeing in the West is really a slow intrusion of that reflex, right? If you criticize trans activism while you are a very liberal person, as per J.K. Rowling, that's not allowed because you are a transphobe. Saying that boys don't menstruate becomes a very controversial issue that makes you pretty much indistinguishable from Hitler. If you have any reservations about some of the tactics or some of the points of Black Lives Matter, well, you are a racist who doesn't love Black people. And so this is the way that slowly but surely the old proverbial parable about the frog that boils. If you boil it slowly, you don't eventually realize, the frog doesn't realize that it's boiling. This is what's happening, slowly but surely, slow intrusions that then cause each of us to self-censor. Look, I can give you probably a million examples, and that wouldn't be too much of hyperbole, of people who've written to me where it is truly impossible for me to know whether they're writing from North Korea, from Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party, or from a Canadian or American or British university. They're afraid to like a tweet. They're afraid to retweet something. They're afraid to say something to their family members because maybe they will be denounced. Is this the kind of environment that we want to live in? I don't think so.
So I guess what they would probably say, I mean, I also have friends who I've been talking to, and you do self-censor to some extent. You get more careful with what you say. They would say, why would you be against anti-racism? Why choose that as an issue to speak up in any way critical of when it's such a kind of clear-cut moral good? So I guess their answer would be, why cause difficulty around this issue when it seems to be such a kind of slam dunk in the right direction?
But that's not all that the BLM folks are saying or what the trans activists are saying. So let's take, for example, trans activism, because I'm, in a sense, more familiar with that because it deals with some of my scientific research, and I've appeared in front of the Canadian Senate a few years ago to precisely talk about a trans bill. I am socially as liberal as they come, right? I fight for trans rights in the Middle East, where it's a lot more dangerous to be fighting for those rights than to be fighting for those rights at Wellesley College outside Boston, right? So I fully and unequivocally support the rights of any person to live in full dignity and free of bigotry. That doesn't mean, though, that in the pursuit of that laudable goal, we murder truth, right? So I could say I fully stand with trans people to live lives of full dignity, while also saying that it might be wrong to say that boys menstruate. It might be wrong to say that some women have 9-inch penises. In other words, we don't need to negate truth in the service of the pursuit of very laudable social justice.
It comes down to kind of manners, doesn't it? A lot of those trans questions that you raise. I mean, presumably you are in favor of good manners. I mean,
Of course.
you don't want to come up to someone you like and say something that you know they're going to find offensive, or if you go to another culture that you know there are certain things that you don't say, you avoid them out of courtesy. Is the same not true in the trans debate, that if there are certain things that really upset people, you just steer clear of it out of courtesy?
I mean, look, let's take the example of my good friend Jordan Peterson. When he was fighting against gender pronouns, he wasn't fighting against the idea that if some person comes up to you and says, "Excuse me, sir, do you mind if you address me in this manner," that you should be dogged in not doing so, right? So he wasn't fighting against civility or good manners. He was saying that those dynamics should be carried out privately between good, decent people. It shouldn't be the government that is dictating how or who is allowed to be decent and in what form. That's the danger, right? So, of course, if a person comes up to me and says, "Hey, I would like you to address me this way," I wouldn't be a good person if I said, "No, I'm going to taunt you by not addressing you that way." But it's not for the government to tell me you better do it. It's not for the government to say you better not disagree with the idea that boys menstruate. Otherwise, you're engaging in transphobia. So again, let's all be kind. Let's all be polite to each other to the best of our abilities. But in the pursuit of a civil society, we don't murder truth.
But where in the world is the government saying you can't object to the idea that boys don't menstruate?
Well, I can't tell you specifically in which place, which specific statement of trans activism is legal or not. But even if we remove the government from this, because that sounds more nefarious, you could be canceled, you could be fired. Would that be okay? So the issue is not simply whether the government is infringing on my freedom of speech. It's, are you creating an environment that allows people to speak freely or not, right? When YouTube decides to demonetize half of your videos, and then someone writes to me and says, "But Dr. Saad, YouTube is not the government." Well, obviously, I'm aware that YouTube is not the government, but they are engaging in nefarious actions. They're saying that if someone, for example, Joe Rogan was supposed to bring on some folks, some physicians, some infectious disease specialists who were going to offer their expert advice on why the lockdown might be draconian. But that particular position was contrary to the one that is acceptable by the orthodoxy. So they were going to remove those clips. And as I understand it, one of the reasons why he left the Spotify is that he wasn't going to be bullied in this way. So again, freedom of speech.
We had that on this channel. We had one of our videos was taken down by YouTube. We campaigned and it was put back up. But it was also on the topic of COVID, and the expert we were talking to, a very celebrated and established professor, nonetheless was deemed unacceptable or a danger to public health and was taken down, although then restored. So I hear you, and we've experienced that even here.
Exactly. And, I'm someone who, just by temperament, by personality, maybe by my personal background of having escaped Lebanon, I'm very dogged, and anybody who follows me, follows my work. I'm combative in the pursuit of truth. I'm dogged in the pursuit of truth. But even I'm getting tired and beaten up by the relentless cancel culture, right? So if someone like me, who literally walks around like a Zahavian signal, I don't care. I'm going to defend truth till the death. And if I can start being weary, that's not a good sign, right? And again, to repeat, I receive innumerable, like right now, from the time that we started this conversation till now, I can probably go in my emails and I'll have 10 new emails from professors, from students, from parents of students saying, "This is my testimony, professor, help me." This is not the kind of society we want to live in. I came from such a society, right? Even, quote, progressive Lebanon was a place where you had to be careful in terms of what you said. Well, do we want to live in such a society? If yes, let's keep doing exactly what we're doing. If not, the silent majority needs to take up the mantle and fight against these intrusions.
So it's a lot to do with social media, isn't it? I mean, social media has kind of provided a structure for what otherwise might be much harder to pin down, which is a kind of sense of disapproval. And it's almost there's a ratchet effect that if someone starts disapproving of something, everyone piles on and it becomes this movement that's quite frightening. it's a social media problem.
It is, in that the mob is now amplified, right? I mean, imagine the grotesque reality of teenage bullying. Well, traditionally, your tormentors, who could end up ruining your life, who could lead you to suicide, tragically, were restricted to 2, 3, 10, that you knew exactly their geographic location. If I end up going to my high school, I know that these bullies will come after me. Well, today, they're not 10 or 12, they're 10 or 12,000, and they're diffused around the globe, and they're coming after you. So again, imagine when most people don't have the thick skin to withstand such scrutiny, such bullying, such intimidation. What are they going to do? They're going to say, it's not worth it, and I'll shut up. Therefore, the ones who are truly activists, who truly want to change the world, are the ones that will remain holding the rest of us hostage. It is grotesque, and it's truly tiresome and worrisome.
I mean, it sounds like I'm now playing devil's advocate, but bear with me here. So, I mean, the counterside is that, you have a successful YouTube channel. This is a platform controlled by the, wicked liberals in charge, and they haven't taken it down.
Yeah.
It may even generate revenue. I don't know. You have large followings on other social media channels. So aren't you a living example of the fact that you can say what you like and
yeah,
free speech still exists?
I appreciate the devil's advocate angle, but let me trash it into oblivion in a second. You are healthy and perfectly fine until you have your heart attack, right? In other words, to state that the current reality at time t suggests that there's nothing to worry about, let's wait till time t+1. What about t+2? What about t+3, right? So we were perfectly fine in Lebanon until we had to run for our lives because our heads were going to be separated from the rest of our bodies. But prior to us running for our lives, we were living perfectly fine in Lebanon. So again, someone with some foresight would say, let me extrapolate from the current point to where we're heading. Incidentally, that's one of the reasons why I often remark that my satire is prophetic, because the strategy that I use to generate my satire is I take a current position of lunacy and I extend it to its boundary condition. I say, what would be the most insane thing that would arise if I push this line of argumentation to its illogical end? And that's where I place my satire. Then I sit back with my arms folded and wait a month or 2 or 3, and the reality catches up to my satire. So to go back to your point, yes, of course I have a YouTube channel, but maybe tonight it will be taken down. Maybe tomorrow I'll say something and it'll be taken down. They are there. They're watching. They're waiting. Maybe I haven't made a wrong enough step yet, but maybe tomorrow, inshallah.
Do you think, just to go back to this idea of these specific movements for a sec, because I think it's quite important I think most people would agree, if you did an opinion poll, that cancel culture is a bad thing and that people should be allowed to express their views, within boundaries of not causing unreasonable offense. What specific things have worried you? Let's take the last few weeks. Have there been specific things either within the wider Black Lives Matter movement or within the trans discussion where you've thought, the line is now crossed? This is a concrete example of something that has gone too far.
Well, certainly all the looting and the violence, everybody should be allowed to engage in peaceful protest, but it should never devolve into violence. So to the extent that some of that might be linked to BLM, then of course I don't support that. But again, I think whatever is happening with these specific movements is really part, and forgive now the shameless plug, is really part of what I talk about in my forthcoming book about idea pathogens. So the general principle is that there is a cocktail of idea pathogens, all of which have been spawned within the ecosystem of the university, that have led us astray in our commitment to reason, to logic, to evidence-based thinking. And so what I do in the book is I begin by enumerating and explaining all those idea pathogens, which I'm happy to discuss with you here. And then as any epidemiologist would do, once you identify the source of the virus and how the virus spreads, then you hopefully offer some inoculation against it, some vaccine against it. So what would be some decision-making strategies that we could use to try to forestall being parasitized by these idea pathogens? So let me give you some examples of these idea pathogens. Postmodernism would be the classic, the granddaddy of all idea pathogens, because it basically says that there are no objective truths. My truth matters more than some objective truth. Now, you can see that, for example, in the trans movement, right? You could see how postmodernism sets the fertile environment. I don't care about biological reality. What my truth is determines what my gender or biological sex is, and so on, right? So biophobia would be another one, fear of biology. So as someone who applies evolutionary psychology to study behavioral sciences, I spent much of my scientific career trying to convince my colleagues that it doesn't make sense that every single other species on Earth, we use evolutionary theory to explain its behaviors. But when it comes to humans, we're somehow above our biology. We transcend our biology. Or in some cases, people are willing to use evolution to explain why we have opposable thumbs, but they're not willing to explain anything that comes above the neck. Your brain, your mind, somehow exists outside of the purview of biology. Well, this leads to something like radical feminism, where you reject the idea that there are innate sex differences. No liberal person rejects the idea that men and women should be equal under the law. But again, in the pursuit of that laudable goal, we don't reject basic biological realities. So I think for me, it's not so much the BLM movement or the trans movement that worry me. It's more that there is a slow rejection of reality in the West, and we need to fight against this.
So this when you say it comes out of the universities, this is a very common complaint that they're kind of hotbeds of some of these crazy ideas, or well-meaning but ideas that have sort of become overly radicalized. Is that your experience at the university you work at? I mean, are your colleagues in the department kind of
right,
postmodern radicals?
So not too many in my own department, because I'm housed in the business school, and places like the business school, the engineering school, reality matters. In other words, you can't afford to create edifices of bullshit detached from reality, because there are consequences. You can't be a postmodernist and build bridges. It crashes. You can't be an aerospace engineer and say there are no universal truths of physics. So by the same token, there are marketing principles, economic principles, finance principles that are very much rooted in reality. So I can't quite pull off the postmodernist baloney in a business school. So in that sense, I'm slightly shielded when I walk in the halls of the business school. But once I step out of those hallways and I enter the ideologically infested departments, well, then all bets are off, buddy.
Did they cross the street when you walked down on campus, or?
So I haven't had any direct. Well, I've had a few on social media interactions that weren't pleasant, usually started by the other person. On campus, people have been nothing but kind to me. But I know for a fact that there are people at the university that distance themselves from me, frankly, in a very shameful way, because you would think that someone who is fighting for the types of truly liberal ideals that I am would be appreciated. But precisely because I am irreverent against the orthodoxy, because I do speak my mind, because I'm not politically correct, I don't try to be mean to anybody, but I just say it like it is, well, then I'm, quote, a troublemaker. And so that causes a bit of tension among some of the administrator class. But overall, they've frankly been, quite laissez-faire about it. So I can't truly complain.
So you mentioned there that you're truly liberal. Would you describe yourself as a liberal, presumably, in a traditional sense?
In the most traditional sense, yes. I don't like to use labels, not because I'm trying to be coy or shifty, but because I truly judge ideas on their individual merits. So, for example, if you were to ask me, what's your position on the death penalty? Well, then you would think I'm ultra-conservative. If you ask me, what do you think about, what's your position on trans issues and gay issues, then you'd think I'm ultra-liberal, right? If you'd ask me, what do you think about immigration policies? Well, then you would think I'm to the right. So in other words, depending on the issue, I can be as left as you can be, or in some cases, I could be a lot more towards the right. So it's hard. When I say classical liberal, I'm referring specifically to individual dignity, right? I despise identity politics. Identity politics is a cancer to the human spirit. Identity politics is what you get in the Lebanese civil war. I come from the ecosystem of identity politics, right? So I judge each individual based on the totality of their merits and their flaws. I don't see black, white, gray. I don't see gender orientation. I see you, and I judge you as a great person or as an ass based on your individual instantiation of your humanity. That, to me, is classical liberalism.
I think that's right. And you also talk in terms of rationality a lot. Which is the great ideal of classical liberals. I mean, I wonder though, hasn't the place we've now arrived at with these kind of extreme forms of liberalism, it's in a way, it's just the logical conclusion of the Enlightenment, of earlier forms of liberalism, isn't it? An ideology that sets itself up as freedom of the individual above all, and throwing off of structures that keep people closed in, sort of leads eventually to self-identification, to denial of biological reality as its ultimate conclusion. Don't you think that the kind of original flaw of liberalism was baked in from the start?
I mean, I don't think so, because why would it be that if I believe in the individual dignity of each individual, that must somehow lead to the slippery slope of denying biological realities? I mean, you can perfectly, in a free society, identify as whatever you want, identify as a car, but then don't punish me for not going on the ride to celebrate your personhood. This is the problem, right? Be a Muslim if you want, and look, being Lebanese, I probably have more Muslim friends than most people will ever encounter in their lives. But I do have problems with certain tenets of Islam when it tries to encroach on the rights of non-Muslims. And we certainly have 1,400 years of history of that. So in other words, do whatever you want, identify as what you want, pray to whichever God you want. Don't ever intrude a single nanometer on the rights of someone else. Isn't that what a true classical liberal is?
Do you think, when you see some of these movements, that there is a religious element to them? This is something we've been thinking about a bit. You know, obviously genuflection and taking the knee is a religious symbol, but you know, there's a lot of kind of almost religious atmosphere to some of this. You know, do you think this is essentially secular, post-Christian, post-Jewish groups of people who are looking for virtues and looking for big ideals to believe in that makes their life more meaningful? Do you think that's a fair reading of some of that impulse?
Absolutely. So just to build on, you know, the kneeling ritual and so on, self-flagellation. So I have a section in my forthcoming book where I talk about that, you know, it has become virtuous to self-flagellate, you know, at the progressive altar, right? The way that I demonstrate how pious I am is by saying, I hate my skin color. I despise Britain. We are evil. We are disgusting. Self-flagellate, right? Well, as you well know, and many of your viewers know, self-flagellation is something that is found in many religious rituals. So the analogy between traditional religions and, you know, the woke religion is certainly apropos. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that people become into the woke religion because they're looking for an alternative, because I happen to be Jewish, but I also happen to be an ardent atheist. And yet I wasn't pulled into the church of wokeness because I actually pray at the altar, again, metaphorically, of reason and science, because somebody now will write a comment section, you're thinking, oh, so, but you are religious in your own way. I'm using poetic prose, right? So I belong to the tribe of truth. I don't defend a Jewish guy when he says something insane because he is part of my tribe. I am just as offended by some grotesque, idiotic thing that some rabbi friend says than I would if he were Muslim or atheist. So in other words, the way by which I navigate through life is am I doing the best that I can to be true to truth? Now, you might say, but what do you consider to be truth? Well, as a scientist, I have complete epistemic humility. I recognize that truth is always provisional. What we thought was true 500 years ago in science is no longer true. So I'm always open to having my mind changed. By the way, that's something that the woke religion doesn't do, and hence it is a religion. It has a set of revealed truths, right? It is true because it is true. Do not criticize trans activism. It is true, as J.K. Rowling found out. And so, again, I don't know if it's because it's my personhood, that's the way I am, or because of having come from Lebanon. I despise attacks on truth. People ask me, why is it that you fight so much? You take on so much, and antipathy, if you'd like, animus from people. Well, because at the end of the day, when I go to bed at night, I have a very exacting code of personal conduct. I need to feel that I did, however big my platform or however small it is, I've done what I could to fight for truth. If I've done that, I sleep well at night. If I don't, I'm a fraud.
How does this map onto politics, do you think?
What specifically?
Well, the ideas about rationality and leaving that behind, or whether people have been gripped by non-rational taboos and those kinds of things. How does that have anything to do with the political situation?
Oh my God, does it ever?
So how does that? Let's start with the US, since a lot of our viewers are from there. How do you understand the political battle in that context?
Right. So I think that one of the reasons why, and I'm hardly the first one to say this, I think one of the reasons that Trump won is precisely because he is considered the exemplar of fighting against some of the woke temple, right? And so he is the representation of the opposite of that, right? So that explains why he's there, in part why he's there. Now let's look at our prime minister. He is the walking instantiation of every single idea pathogen that I describe in my book. I mean, in other words, he has both, so to analogize to diseases, he has both cancer and diabetes and Alzheimer and dementia, right? So he suffers from
Trudeau.
This is Justin Trudeau, right? He is a walking representation of all those bad ideas. So let me give you a specific example, because you're asking about politics, how the downstream effect of all these bullshit ideas end up in politics, in culture, in organizations. So now in the Canadian government, everything is driven by adherence to what I call the DIE religion: diversity, inclusion, and equity. How we allocate prestigious professorships is in part determined by adherence to the DIE religion. Now, again, I'm the first to say if there's institutional bigotry, as there have been, say, against women historically in the university, then we need to redress that. But once you no longer have that institutional bigotry, so for example, in the United States, if you look across every level of educational attainment and across every single racial groups, in every single cell, women outnumber men. So how could we still hang on to the narrative that they are being so maligned when it is the exact, you couldn't have data that is more perfectly contrary to that narrative. So adhering to the DIE narrative is perfectly incongruent with a meritocracy, right? I believe in a meritocracy. I don't think the person who wins the 100-meter dash should in part be given to him or her based on their gender identity or skin color. The person who passes the line first wins.
So in the US, if we have Biden versus Trump, which it looks like we are, who would you support?
Who do you think I would say?
Well, I don't know. You've been talking favorably about Donald Trump because he's against political correctness, and Biden seems to be highly politically correct.
So if we're choosing between these two, forgive me for interrupting you. If we're choosing between these two, I will take Trump because I prefer someone who is as brash, and to many people, I call it an aesthetic injury. It's literally an aesthetic injury. He's brash the way he speaks. He's not presidential, right? Obama was tall. He had a mellifluous voice. He has a radiant smile. Therefore, he must say profound things. No, he says complete bullshit. But my God, does he intoxicate me while he says them? Whereas Trump looks grotesque. He's obnoxious, right? Therefore, he's disgusting. So certainly to the highfalutin ivory tower folks that I hang out with, he is grotesque. He must be rejected. Doesn't matter what the content of his words are. So to answer your question, given that Biden right now doesn't know whether he's a human being or an avocado in the Cleopatra era, that's how quickly he's losing his mind. I mean, and I'm not being hyperbolic. I mean, you could see a million interviews where he's not there. Then I think if I'm forced to make that choice, I'm going with brash and vulgar Trump.
So the kind of irony that I'm trying to push up against here is that actually those ivory tower liberals, in a way, are much closer to you philosophically than Donald Trump is, because they also, at least they tell themselves, they believe in rationality. Their kind of vision of a beautiful, ordered world with, where borders are downplayed, where kind of emotive questions of culture and individual difference don't bubble up above the surface, and where everything is kind of pragmatic. That's very much a kind of rational, liberal vision. And in a way, what Donald Trump has done is he has allowed out very much non-rational, more kind of emotive cultural issues to come to the fore. And he kind of rode that wave all the way to the presidency. And in the amazing ability he has to kind of define what happened or didn't happen by just saying it, he's kind of a postmodern president as well. So you're almost on the side of the postmodernists against the rational liberals.
So Trump is the postmodernist? That's a complete different reading of reality. But okay, let's go with it. And let's take a specific example. Is it rational to hold hands, sing Imagine, and say, down with open borders, people who believe in closed borders are Nazis? Or is it rational to say, well, it makes sense to have control over your national borders? Which is the rational position according to you?
Well, I think their whole vision of a borderless world is based on the idea that things like where you come from shouldn't rationally make a difference. And that, if we are being truly rational, all individuals should be these sort of atomized floating blobs, and we should all just be judged by our merits. So it comes out of the same instinct.
Yeah. Well, okay, let me now push back against this. Yes, where you come from doesn't matter, in that I don't stop you from coming into my country because you come from country X or Y. However, people are also the sum total of their upbringing, their culture, their religion. So if, for example, your religious background and cultural background causes it that you come from a culture that has 99% endemic Jew hatred or 95% endemic homophobia, well, then I have every perfectly valid reason, and it is rational to say, well, there is a problem in terms of cultural homophily. Homophily is we are attracted to things that are similar to us, and you see it across the animal world for many phenomena. So it makes sense for me to want to attract people who share my values. Now, someone from Yemen who is truly liberal in that they don't believe in imposing their religion on anybody, they don't have endemic Jew hatred, might be a perfect candidate to come to my utopian liberal society. But if you are coming 100,000 of you, of which I know that from statistics in the Pew surveys, 95% of you hold endemic Jew hatred in your heart, well, then it makes perfect rational sense to say, wait a second, maybe we want to be a bit more careful before we have a complete breakdown of our society. There's nothing irrational about that.
I just remember so clearly that strange year 2016, where we had Brexit in the UK in the spring, and then it went forward to the Trump-Clinton election in November. And both of those elections were kind of similar feeling. And in both cases, the losing side presented itself as the rational, enlightened side. It was all about evidence. And Hillary Clinton endlessly said she wants evidence-led policy, and she had beautiful 5-point plans for all of the problems, and that's not what won the day. So it's interesting that the people on that side of the political argument definitely felt like they were the enlightened liberal rationalists.
Right. Look, I think a lot of times people ask me, why do you spend so much more time critiquing and criticizing the left than you do the right? Is this your way of signaling to the world that you are on the right? And my answer is actually terribly obvious and simple. I exist in the ecosystem that is most infected with leftist ideology, right? The ecosystem of academia is a hotbed of left. Now, some of the left ideas are great. Some of them are complete, utter bullshit, right? So therefore, the reason why I criticize the left more than I do the right is for the same reason that the dermatologist focuses on skin disorders, not diabetes, because that person specializes in skin disorders. That doesn't mean that diabetes is not important, but that's not what I specialize in. So the fact that I focus a lot more on leftist ideas, I'm not implying that they are irrational and the right is rational. Because, for example, when it comes to the rejection of evolution, as an evolutionary scientist, well, typically the right is much more likely to reject evolution. So in that case, I would be much more likely to criticize a senator from the Deep South who rejects evolution. But the totality of my interventions are geared more towards the left, not because I'm of the right, but that's because that's the disease that I'm exposed to in my ecosystem.
So do you think there's any cause for optimism in this discussion? I mean, I've noticed even in the past week or two, when you mentioned the J.K. Rowling transgression for which she was kind of nearly cancelled on social media, a lot of people who would describe themselves as kind of left liberals and who are kind of on the politically correct end of things were still not convinced by that. And they thought that what she said was reasonable. And, you know, polling shows that most people would agree with what she said. So I wonder whether these kind of radical components within that movement are overplaying their hand. And actually, there's already signs that people are being turned off by it. And there might be a new sort of coalescence around a more sensible center ground.
Well, from your lips to the cosmos's ear, usually we say to God's ear, but since I'm an atheist, I'll turn it to cosmos's ear. Look, traditionally, I'm someone who's very optimistic. In the last week or so, I think the cancel culture has hit me hard. So I just happen to be situationally tired. So if you ask me today, I'm a bit more pessimistic, but I think that will hopefully subside. I think that the silent majority, as you correctly pointed out, are not on board with many of these, fringe ideas. The problem, though, is that in addition to the 7 deadly sins, there's an 8th one that we should be adding, and that is human cowardice. Most people are unwilling to speak up, right? So they're perfectly willing in the thousands, I mean, literally thousands, write to me, professors, administrators, physicians. Oh my God, you're such a hero. I support you. I'm not saying this to be immodest. I'm just sharing what the reality is. Oh, but please don't share. If you share this on your social media, don't mention my name. So if you don't have the courage to even say, I support Gad Saad openly and publicly because he defends ideals that I think we should all be supporting. If you don't have the courage to do that, then I'm not optimistic. But if you tell me that somehow we're going to ignite the collective courage of the silent majority to speak, well, then I think that we will quickly drown out the lunacy and we will return to a commitment to reason.
Fascinating. Well, Gad Saad, thank you so much for that. There we have evidence-based thinking put in the defense of Donald Trump. And for a lot of people, that might be surprising, but we live in a surprising world. Thank you. That was really, really interesting.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
That was Gad Saad, evolutionary psychologist, blogger, YouTuber, and campaigner for free speech, telling us why Donald Trump is the rational option in November. So that was a surprising and interesting turn of events. His book, The Parasitic Mind, is out later this year. This was Lockdown TV from UnHerd. Hope you enjoyed. We'll be back in the next couple of days.